Welcome to Navigating a Broken Vessel. I'm Dave Harris. I'm so happy that you joined me today. I'll tell you what, I have this crazy breakthrough that happened, and I want to talk about it. I've been excited to talk to you about it ever since Monday. Today's Sunday, ever since Monday, so it's been almost a whole week. I've wanted to talk to you about this major breakthrough that's happened. I think my wife would agree that it's a major breakthrough, things like that. So a little bit of history. So first of all, my main career, what I do for a living is working with artificial intelligence. I started with a full career shift it's been 5 years ago, actually almost exactly 5 years ago. I was a college professor for 12 years teaching media production. And then 5 years ago, I made a complete career change. And this was made possible because of the time I was a college professor. I got free tuition, and so I was able to take all these different courses in computer science and math and things like that. And so even though I didn't necessarily get any bachelor's degrees, I was able to pick up a couple of master's degrees, one in data analytics, one in instructional design, and another one in communication, along with this PhD in communication that I picked up as well along the way. Here's the thing is I decided about 5 years ago to look for a job that was based on my passion. And I looked for instructional design / computer science / communication, video production, things like that. And I couldn't find anything, and finally came across this job in all of those, basically as a curriculum developer, developing for big tech, big data companies. And I ended up getting a job, worked there for a few years. And since that time now, I've worked for a company that does big data analysis, artificial intelligence. I worked for another company building just artificial intelligence curriculum. And currently I'm working for a government contractor working with artificial intelligence and training people how to use AI and machine learning as well. And so I have a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience with artificial intelligence. And I can tell you that one of the things we tell people all the time when we're teaching is we say, hey, it's all about the prompt, right? It's all about how you communicate with the AI. It's all about making sure that that AI, who's really just a really smart intern, how you can communicate with this intern, this AI, and get what you need out of the AI. It's all about the prompt. It's all about communicating with that AI. Now, with that background in mind, I want to talk to you about the last few years. The last few years, I have not been in therapy. I was up until about maybe 3 years ago, somewhere in that area. I would go and talk to a therapist who I strongly respect. He's a fantastic person. He's helped my children. He's helped my whole family. He's just a phenomenal guy. Love him to death. But I kind of thought, you know what, I'm going to get out of the therapy thing for a little bit and just see what I can do on my own. And so I wasn't seeing my therapist for about 3 years. And I decided a few weeks back, it's probably been 3 weeks, somewhere in that area, that I would try to lose some weight. And I know that weight loss is like 70% psychological. It's all in my brain. It's an addiction, essentially, to food. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to pick up on this therapy again. I'm going to talk to the therapist, make some appointments, see what I can do to maybe help myself not have this food addiction and lose some weight. And maybe you can tell if you're watching on YouTube, I've lost a little bit of weight, actually. I've lost about 16 pounds in the last month or so, somewhere in that area, which I think is really good. Anyway, don't let me digress. So during my therapy session, I was just talking to him about normal stuff, talking to him about food, the normal thing. That's what you do in talk therapy. But this last Monday, which was my second appointment with him after that 3-year gap, he said, Dave, and it was almost like in passing. He's like, you know what? I'll bet if we were to test you, do the autism test for you, I'll bet we would find that you are probably close to being autistic, but not over the line to where we would consider you to be autistic. And he said, and this was near the end of the session, and he said, I would consider you to be, and he used the word neurodivergent. Neurodivergent, which I'd never heard before, and maybe some of you have heard it out there. I totally get it. That's totally fine. I had never heard of it before. And he said neurodivergent, and he explained just a little bit, and then the time was up. He had another appointment, and he had to go. One of the things he mentioned to me, though, this is where I talk to you about AI, right? This is why I brought it up. He said, here's the thing. You can use AI to maybe learn about neurodivergency, or if that's what it's called, neurodivergency. Sure, that works for me. Being neurodivergent, and maybe even talk to the AI about your specific situation. Talk about how you take Spravato, how you have antidepressants, how you do therapy, basically lay it all out there and work with AI. Now, before I continue on, I'm going to say the disclaimer, right? First of all, this podcast is not a medical podcast, right? I'm not a medical professional. You should seek out a medical professional. And I would also say with regard to AI, it's the same kind of thing, right? You should not be getting your therapy from an AI. I'm just going to tell you how you might be able to use AI, how I used AI, and how I had this major breakthrough. So I do want to give you those disclaimers. Basically, seek out professionals if you need that professional help. With that in mind, I went home, and that night I just grabbed my phone, and there's my phone right there. And I've got a few AIs on my phone. I've got actually probably most of them, the ones you're familiar with. I'm sure I've got them, and I use them all the time. This time I was working with Gemini from Google, and I'll just walk you through the conversation I had with AI. It says, what is neurodivergence? I just put it out there. Start from the beginning. And Gemini, of course, comes back with quite a bit of information about what neurodivergence is, talks about ADHD, talks about autism, talks about others like dyslexia and dyspraxia and Tourette's and things like that. And then the AI asked me a question, said, are you asking because you're exploring a specific trait in yourself or someone you know, or are you just curious about the broader movement? And I thought, that's actually a really interesting question. And I responded with, my therapist told me I was neurodivergent. And so then, of course, the AI responds and says, oh, okay, wow. Now, this is what's kind of interesting. The response says, this is a significant, quote, light bulb moment to navigate. For many people, hearing this from a professional feels like finally being handed the instruction manual for a piece of hardware that they've been trying to operate for years without an instruction manual. And then it continues on about an aha moment. It talks about neurodivergency, how I might be, if I am, then how some of the traits that it might be. Then again, it's a follow-up question. It says, first of all, it's worth noting that neurodivergent is a broad term. Did your therapist mention a specific flavor of neurodivergence, like ADHD or autism, or are you just beginning to pull on that thread together, right? Just starting out. And I put basically what the therapist and I have talked about. First of all, that I do have ADHD. We know that for sure. And then also based on what he had said, and I hadn't taken a test, no autism test or anything, but he says probably really close. And so I just responded and said, definitely ADHD and very mild autism is how I put it. And then it said, and this is to me, like you have to imagine, I'm just in bed, my wife's asleep, and I'm just kind of working through this. Every time I get an answer from the AI, I'm like, what the heck? How does this thing know? Anyway, it responds and says that combination, meaning the ADHD and just a little bit of autism, is referred to in the community as AuDHD. Now, I don't know the pronunciation because it's written, right? But it's AuDHD. So rather than the ADHD, right, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it adds kind of that autism, A and then lowercase u. So it's AuDHD. AuDHD or autism, ADHD, whatever you want to say. It says it's a unique experience because ADHD and autism can sometimes feel like they are opposite forces living in the same brain, which can be both exhausting and incredibly powerful. And then it talks about the tug-of-war, how I've got basically these two operating systems. Well, it doesn't say that I do, but as I'm reading it, I'm like, whoa, that's exactly how it feels. That's exactly what I experience in my life. It essentially says, hey, you've got ADHD. The ADHD wants novelty. It wants things to be different and new and fun and whatever. And then you have the autism, which is like the complete opposite. It wants things to be structured and the same thing every day and all this other stuff. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I am. In fact, it reminded me of one of the previous episodes that we've had here on Navigating a Broken Vessel called The Lazy Perfectionist, where I explained how I feel like I want things to be perfect, but I'm too lazy to carry them out. And again, that laziness comes from the lack of novelty. It's boring, right? That's all there is to it. It's boring. And so I thought, dude, this is exactly how I'm thinking. So then, of course, the AI talks about the tug-of-war and then asks the question, does this tug-of-war description resonate with your daily experience, Or is there one side, the ADHD or the autism, that feels more in charge of your life right now? And I responded, which is the truth, ADHD is bigger, right? I definitely feel the tug of war, but I feel that the ADHD is more in charge. And then the AI again says, yep, ADHD seems to sometimes be in the driver's seat, continues to give me more information, how the ADHD is louder, how the two can be somewhat balanced, but many times the ADHD is more. And then it gives me a pro tip. And this is kind of interesting because it says pro tip. Many AuDHD people find that when they start medication for ADHD, their autistic traits actually become more noticeable. Once the ADHD noise is turned down, the autistic need for routine and sensory calm becomes much clearer. And I've actually experienced that. As I've been taking ADHD medicine, I've been prescribed the medication, and I have found that exactly to be true. And so now you can imagine me just like all the time being like, this is totally me. I can't believe this. And it asks the question then. Again, it always asks a question at the end. Does this social hangover or project graveyard? Now, I better talk about the project graveyard. This is the craziest thing for me because I always have conversations with my wife about how I'm like Mr. 80%. And that's the term, that's the percentage I've been using. And I've been having discussions with her probably for 10 years, probably longer, 15 years, about me being an 80% kind of a guy. And so this project graveyard that the AI, that Gemini was talking about, is the idea that I will start a project because it's new, it's fascinating, it gets that ADHD aspect of myself, this novel way of thinking, where I want to explore something new. And then the project itself, most people would say, well, you need to complete the project. But for me, at about 80%, it just seems like I just know what I need to know from the project. In other words, I learned what I wanted to learn from the project. The project itself, therefore, is now ancillary. It doesn't matter if it gets done. And so, like, my wife will talk to me all the time. And I mean, I don't know. Yes, it's been for the last 15 years we've been talking, but I've been doing this for a long time. We've been married 25 years. I can tell you that about 20 years ago, I began knitting a sweater. I just decided I wanted to start knitting. And so I grabbed some yarn, I got the knitting needles, I learned how to knit, and I started knitting a sweater. And that sweater is sitting in my closet today, 20 years later, with just the seam, the inside seam of one of the sleeves unfinished. In other words, it's not done. And I would honestly believe it's 80%. Like my yard, my front yard, I've been working on it for the last few years, and it's been sitting for about a year now with nothing happening. It's about 80% done. It happens all the time where the novelty of it, the interesting thing, like, hey, I can do that. I'm going to learn how to do that and decide I want to do that. And then the project itself, it's like, I get to learn. And then about 80%, it's like, okay, I feel like I've mastered that, quote unquote, right? Now I know I've learned what I need to learn. It's the same with oil painting. I started oil painting. I feel like I got pretty good at oil painting. And then I'm like, okay, cool. I'm done with oil painting. And I should show you some of these oil paintings that I made. I actually, looking back, they're pretty good. And this is like 10 years ago. I have a double bass. I literally bought a double bass instrument, the large, big double bass, the one that's about as tall as a person, right? I bought one. It's sitting in my bedroom, and there's another story with that, but I am not a double bass player yet, and I've owned it for about a year and a half, something like that. I could tell you over and over and over again. So what Gemini talked about was this, it referred to this project graveyard. And I thought, how is Gemini knowing exactly what's going on with me? In fact, Gemini even used 80%. Now, when I say Gemini, I know that this comes from the research. I did a little research myself, and I found that it used to be, and again, I'm not a medical professional. You should not be taking this as medical advice for sure. But in my research, I found that it used to be that you could not be diagnosed with both ADHD and autism. They were thought to be both ends of a continuum, meaning if you were one, you were all the way the opposite direction of the other. And what they found about 10 or 12, 13 years ago is that you could have both. And actually they're finding that is something that's happening. And so when I see Gemini getting this research for me and presenting it for me, and again, making sure I myself am making sure it's not just hallucinations, that this is true, that it's not telling me what I want to hear, so to speak, that this is totally true. And it completely explains everything about my life, the project graveyard, the way that I have a hard time talking to people, it's the fight that goes on inside my mind. And so then I thought, okay, well, in fact, this is what I put to Gemini after this. I put, all of what you are saying is exactly how I am. That was my next response. Everything that you're saying is exactly how I am. And then Gemini says, there's a specific kind of relief that comes with finding out that you aren't a failed version of a normal person, but rather a perfectly functioning version of a different kind of person. And that hit home. And in fact, that's the next sentence that it says. When those descriptions hit home, it's usually because you've spent years trying to use a map for London while you're trying to drive in Tokyo. Both are great cities, but the directions just don't work. You've got a map for the wrong city. So here's the thing. I thought, wow, this is me. I can't believe it. Now, I'm not saying, oh, great, the AI, that means I don't have to go to therapy anymore, right? I just use the AI. Nope. I'm meeting with a therapist. I'm going to talk to him about this. In fact, one of my children or my wife, I think, talked to my therapist about some other topic and then just happened to mention, hey, by the way, Dave is totally researching this stuff. He's going crazy with it. And my therapist emailed me and said, hey, I hear you're researching it. That's great. I can't wait to talk to you about it. And so it's like, wow, I have this knowledge now that I'm super excited about talking to the therapist about, because I finally feel like, because I've been diagnosed with ADHD. It's been about 10 years or so. But the whole time I thought it doesn't describe me all the way. It feels like it describes a lot or a big part of me. But there are some other things where I'm like, no, that's not the way I am. I don't do that kind of thing. And so I thought the ADHD, it's like I clearly feel like I have ADHD and the medicines help. But it just always felt like there was something missing. And I feel like now we have this breakthrough, we have this missingness, this aspect that was a part of it that I had no idea. And so then I started asking about, or at least the AI started going into, basically, here are some tips, right? Here are some things that you might be able to try. And so it talks about things like Legos, the project graveyard, how you can overcome that. It gives some ideas for what I might be able to try. It talks about flipping a coin. It talks about doing a menu of different things that I might be able to choose from, depending on kind of how much my dopamine levels are or whatever it might be. And so I told the AI, I said, hey, I have a hard time with continuing and finishing projects that I've started. And it says, okay, great. Here's some ideas. The point is a few things. First of all, I think AI is a great tool. I'm not saying that you should rely solely on AI. I am not saying at all that you should use AI as your therapist. That is not at all what I'm saying. But AI is a fantastic reality. And what it reminds me of is, for me, I almost feel like my brain is the AI. And what I need to do is just feed it the right prompts, right? Just like we talk about it and what I tell people all the time, you just need to make sure you're giving AI the right prompts. That way you get some high quality output from the AI. I think it's the same for my brain. I need to give it the right prompts, right? So rather than saying, Dave, you got to get up there and finish that project. What's wrong with you? Right? I need to feed it the right prompts and say, okay, great, Dave, here are some things you might be able to try based on what you're learning about this diagnosis, which really is telling you how your brain is working. And so I think that AI is a fantastic tool. I think that my brain a lot of times works like an AI, but I've also found the importance again, and I'll say it again and again, the importance of therapy and working with a professional. And I got to tell you that I have been overjoyed. I've continued my process for learning, because that's one of the things I fixate on, is learning. That's one of my things, is I just want to learn. And I've been concentrating on this, focusing on this, hyper-focusing on it. I think people would call it hyper-focusing on this, so that I can understand this a lot better. And I'm excited to meet with the therapist this week. It's going to be an awesome, amazing session. Anyway, that's the episode. Kind of a shorter episode today, but I just wanted to let you know that, Dave's making progress, right? Dave, myself, is navigating a broken vessel. And And I'll tell you what, one day I hope to have my therapist on the show. I think it'll be awesome. I haven't asked him yet, but maybe he will, maybe he won't. But he's such an awesome person. And maybe we'll have him on the show, and you could just, maybe I could be like, hey, you have my permission to say anything you want, right? And he could be like, oh, wow, let's talk about all these things that Dave always thought was a secret. Totally kidding. But you get the idea, right? So I just want to tell you that it's exciting. It's awesome. Use AI to help, right? Use AI. Try and put your symptoms in. But again, don't rely on it. There's all kinds of reasons why AI should not be relied upon. Think of it being like an intern, right? And you were working with this intern, but you're not going to rely on the output of the intern and make it your own, right? And say, yep, I think that intern's fantastic. I'm going to say that what they said was right. Use AI if you want to, for sure, but definitely work with a qualified professional. Anyway, I would love to hear your responses, your feedback to this. Go to our Facebook or Instagram, Navigating a Broken Vessel. You can always email me, dave@navigatingabrokenvessel.com. And I do invite you to look at previous episodes, including that one, The Lazy Perfectionist. And actually, you could probably even listen to all the other ones where I talk more about myself, and you could be like, dude, I could totally see it. And how could Dave not see it the whole time? But that's at navigatingabrokenvessel.com. You could look at those previous episodes. Love to hear from you. Love to hear your conversation. And I'm Dave Harris. I want to thank you so much for being on this episode and wish me luck for the future. Thanks for joining us.